The recently concluded 36th African Union Summit in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, received dozens of African heads of states and other foreign partners with mutual concerns regarding Africa. One of them, the European Union. Now, the African Union and the European Union have been working in collaboration in key areas of progress and development all across Africa. And the health sector is one of the areas that have come up as one of the priorities given COVID-19 pandemic, transforming the health sector into a very important area of focus for different countries around the world. So what have the EU and AU been doing in partnership in the health sector? This is something we'll be looking at today. Hello and welcome to Diplomatic Insights. I am Kirana Baina, and today I will be having a discussion with Ms. Kathleen Van Brempt, who is the chair of the COVI committee and the European Parliament delegation. We'll be looking into what the African Union and the European Union have been doing in partnership in terms of the health sector. Do stay with us. Ms. Brempt, thank you very much for giving us the time today. Thank you so much. So, as you know, the health sector has been deemed one of the promising avenues for the African Union and the European Union to have a partnership in. And actually, the 6th EU-AU summit had seen a lot of commitments being made in terms of the health sector, and it covered a wide range of areas. But to start us off, I want to ask you, what are some of EU's commitments in the health sector for Africa?
Well, let me start by saying, in the corona crisis, the COVID pandemic, we all learned that nobody is safe unless everybody is safe. And that is more than a slogan. It's an acknowledgement that we have to take into account, and that means that we need to be partners to create healthcare, public healthcare sectors all over the world that are accessible for everybody. It's a huge, huge task. And in that sense, we have the partnership between Europe and Africa, and of course Europe and Ethiopia being part of that, making sure that we support the African Union in advancing. Let me give you an example. You have the African CDC, very important, and the African Medicines Agency. Both of them, in terms of support of Africa, becoming a health resilient continent is important, and the European Union supports that, of course, not only in ideas but also with subsidies and revenues going into that into these projects. It is very important that we also establish a narrative on African health, and that is what the European Union supports really very hard.
So you mentioned Corona or the COVID-19 at the beginning of your answer. Now, let's go to the COVID-19 pandemic and that area. Now, the European Union has been leading in international efforts towards combating this pandemic, including in terms of providing vaccinations. Now, it has shown, like you said, its commitment to especially the African CDC, and it has also been trying to address the socioeconomic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. But let's go towards, the support that the EU has been showing to Africa throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, this period. What has that looked like?
Well, it's a double story, I have to say. I'm chair of the COVID committee, and one of the reasons we have that committee is to draw lessons. It was a huge crisis, a pandemic. It hit Europe, it hit Africa, it hit Asia. And as I said, we learned that we only can combat it together. Again, nobody's safe until everybody is safe. And the lessons learned is important. Why do I say that? Because we also made a lot of mistakes. It's okay to make mistakes in life, in politics, as long as we learn from them. And let me give you the example of the vaccines. Vaccines are very important in the corona pandemic, in the sense that it's not the only one, but it's one of the important tools to get us out of the pandemic. That is vaccinating people, keeping people alive, especially the vulnerable ones. One of the big successes over there is that we created a vaccine within a year. That has never ever happened in history of mankind. That was by pulling together all the resources and all the knowledge, public and private, to get the vaccine up and running, to get it approved and to get it produced. That's the good part of the story. Second successful part of the story is, and there it becomes already a little bit difficult, is did we actually make sure that everybody got equal access to these vaccines? The European Union donated more vaccines than any other part of the world. And I'm very proud of that. We were not selfish in keeping these vaccines only to ourselves. But, and here comes the but, very important, what we didn't acknowledge enough, both Europe as COVAX, being the facility that distributes these vaccines, is taking into account the difficulties of the logistics, taking into account good coordination of these vaccines, and we've seen, and that is quite a disgrace, that vaccines were delivered very near the expiring date of these vaccines. So there were a lot of difficulties, and that resulted in unequal access. Still today, the African continent has much lower access, much lower vaccination rates than, for instance, Europe. And the last point, also very important when we take the lessons learned for the future, is that in Europe and in the pharmaceutical industry, which is really powerful and big in Europe, the profits came before well-being of people. We should have been, and that is my personal point of view, there are very different views in Europe, but we should have been much more quicker in sharing technology, sharing knowledge on these vaccines, and I think that's an important lesson for the future.
Speaking of actually sharing knowledge and experience in that regard now, the COVID-19 pandemic had sort of exposed a weakness in the African health sector in terms of the production and the distribution of vaccines. And as you said, it has brought on different kinds of challenges, including the delivery of vaccines that have reached their expiration dates, as you said. So I'm going to go through, dealing with those shortages and dealing with those problems going forward. Now, the EU has been doing a lot in terms of boosting the capacity of African countries. Much progress, for example, has been recorded in Rwanda, Senegal, and also Burkina Faso with all this challenge, I would assume. And so let's look into that. What has the EU been doing in terms of boosting the capacity of Africa in manufacturing of the health products, especially now with the COVID and vaccines?
It's one of the good lessons that we've learned from this pandemic. Never waste a good crisis, The fact that there was so much inequality in getting access to these vaccines. It's not only about getting the vaccines, but also how to deal with them, the logistics. For that you need a full ecosystem. And then it becomes very important that you have local production. Because with local production comes local technology, knowledge, training of people, of your healthcare workers, the logistics. It is one ecosystem. Today, the African continent imports almost all of its vaccines, not just for COVID. For all the necessary vaccines, only 1% you produce yourself. That is unacceptable. The African Union has set a target. By 2040, getting 60% of that production into the African continent. And it's very important that we from the European Union support that narrative and these goals. And it starts with, first of all, local production, like you mentioned in Rwanda, but also in South Africa. And this mission had combined visit to Cape Town with a mission here in Addis Ababa. In Cape Town, we visited Biovac and Afrogen. And Afrogen is a very important institution, because it is today developing mRNA technology for the African continent, with the help of and the support, the financial support of the European Union. And again, I want to stress how important it is to it's not just about fill and finish, you get the vaccines, you put them in a box and no. You need to develop all the steps from the research and development up until the final, logistics to get it into the arms of the people. And it's a long way to go. I'm not telling your viewers that, within a few years we'll get there. No, it's a long process. But when you handle this in a strategic way and you invest in both research and development, in vocational training of people and into public healthcare system, you can get that up and running. And let's hope we get there before a next pandemic hits us.
So you talked about the long process that lays ahead in terms of keeping this in check. Now, my question here is, I wonder is there a system sort of set up by the European Union to make sure that all these processes, the vocational training, etc., these things are put in place to kind of have the wanted or the desired results from this partnership?
Well, the last word you mentioned is key, partnership. It's not about us coming to tell you how the best way to develop the full cycle of these vaccines, and let me mention also other pharmaceutical diagnostics, therapeuticals. It's much more than only vaccines, because what we learned also in the pandemic is Europe is completely differently organized in the healthcare system, in population. For instance, I have to mention that the fact that we were hit much harder in Europe because we have a very old population. It's very vulnerable when a pandemic like this hits us. So they're in logistics, in population, in culture, there's so many differences. That's why partnership is key. Of course we need to share our technologies. Of course we can share a lot of knowledge. But you can share with us so many other things, local embedded healthcare systems, difficulties with logistics. So partnership is key. When I was in Cape Town, we also visited the Genome Institute. That's, by the way, the institute that discovered the Omicron virus, very important. You see, there's so many knowledge in Africa. They discovered the Omicron virus. They're brilliant people. And in that institute, you see people from all over Africa, also from all over the world, but mainly from all over Africa, coming there, studying, making a PhD. And that is also very important. That is not just sharing, here's the formula of this or that. That doesn't work like that. But working together on research and development, partnership, that's the answer.
So regarding this partnership now, I'll assume that there have been many challenges that it has been faced with. For example, one of the biggest things that Africa is challenged with is the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as unrest in different parts of Africa, in different African countries. We can also mention Ethiopia in that regard. For the past 2 years, there was COVID-19 and also the war in the northern conflict, which has been concluded with a peace agreement. So let me ask you, first of all, some of those challenges that have kind of stood in the way of bearing full fruit through this partnership.
Absolutely. It's been very difficult years, the last 2 to 3 years overall, everywhere. In Europe, we're also confronted with a war at European soil. Let me first say something in general. You cannot keep people safe. You cannot keep people healthy and secured if you're in a war situation. So it has been very difficult in Ethiopia, combating both the COVID and handling a war. It also jeopardized the relations between Europe and Ethiopia, with different views, with, I think, a lot of urge in Europe to urge the Ethiopian government to proceed in peace instead of war. So we are very happy with the peace process. We're very supportive with the peace process. And I personally hope, and I'm quite sure that the whole of the European Union hopes that in very short notice of time we can establish normal relationships again between the EU and the Ethiopian government. And that means normalizing all our relationships and getting up and running also with the money that we have in place to invest in the healthcare system and in rebuilding parts of the north of Ethiopia. Peace is so important. No way you can keep your people safe if there is war. And now that we have war in Europe, it's a message that I think is extremely important.
We talked about the peace process and the difficulties that it brought along for Ethiopia. And in regards to Ethiopia now, I want to mention the meeting that you recently just had with the Ministry of Health of Ethiopia, Dr. Liat Taddese. So first I'm going to ask, some of the topics that were addressed with the minister and what areas you covered, what were the discussion points, and what can we expect from that discussion?
Well, with the minister, we discussed, of course, how she and the whole government and the whole Ethiopian people worked on combating this pandemic. With all the difficulties, and we just mentioned also the war, so with all the difficulties also of the war in the north, with the difficulties of getting the vaccines up until the last difficult place, because Ethiopia is a very big country. How difficult, for me that was very interesting. I come from a small country in Europe, Belgium. We have 3 languages, and the minister explained to us the more than 80 ethnic groups and at least as many languages. That is also a very big challenge, a logistic challenge as well. So for us it's interesting to learn and to try and understand how that worked in Ethiopia, but we of course also discussed issues with relation to the African Union. You have the capital of the African Union. Ethiopia is one of the leading countries in the African Union, and getting your strength together within that African Union, as I mentioned, African CDC, the Medicines Agency, how important, she's really stressed how important it is to have a partnership with Europe to try to get that fully up and running. Can I also mention that I really admire her? She's very knowledgeable on the one hand, but also very down to earth. I really liked her. I think she's an excellent woman politician.
That is true. Got us through COVID.
Absolutely.
I'll say that much. So to conclude it on a hopeful note of the future, I want to ask you now in terms of EU and AU partnership in dealing with different health hurdles that may come forward. What are some of the plans that are set by the European Union going forward in terms of working with the AU in dealing with health crises or other situations such as those?
As I mentioned, I think it is important that in the lessons learned of the COVID crisis, we are changing the narrative. Well, Africa is changing the narrative, and I think that's excellent, and Europe will support that. And that means Africa doesn't want to become completely independent of the rest of the world when it comes to supply of pharmaceuticals or vaccines or other things, but much more self-reliant. And I think that it's not about protectionism, it's about getting an ecosystem in place that makes you much more resilient. And we've seen in Europe that also we have a lot of challenges in getting much more prepared and much more resilient. And of course there will be a lot of programs being setting up with a lot of money to be invested. But let me stress, it's not just about money. We think we can solve everything with money, but it's not all about money. It's about coordination, about sharing technology. It is about learning from one another. And for me, that is the most important lessons that we have learned. And to add one thing, this pandemic, most scientists make a relation between this pandemic and climate change. I truly believe that there is a connection, that more pandemics will come because of climate change. Combating pandemics and combating climate change is the same challenge. And there I really want to stress how important the African continent is, because the African continent has huge opportunities. It's not only about challenges, it's also about opportunities, huge opportunities, in making a partnership happen with the European Union when it comes to the Green Deal, when it comes to climate change. And there is a connection with health and climate change, and there we also need that partnership.
That is a very important point that we all need to deal with. Ms. Brempt, thank you very much for your time and your insights today. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And with that, we end today's Diplomatic Insights. We've looked into the partnership between the European Union and the African Union in the health sector, more specifically regarding the COVID-19 pandemic response and support from the European Union to different African countries. I've had a discussion with Ms. Brempt, who is the chair of the COVI committee and the European Parliament delegation. I was Kirana Baina leading you through the program. Until next time.